On the night of October 14th, a man was officially declared dead. His heart had stopped. His brain showed no activity. Two doctors signed the death certificate. And yet, she heard something. His family had already been called. His estate was already being divided. The funeral home had already been contacted. But one woman with nothing to her name was about to do something that would not only save a man's life, but expose the darkest secret inside one of America's most powerful families. This is the story of Maya and Ethan and the night that changed everything. You have to understand something before we go any further. The kind of power the Caldwell family held in this country was not the kind you read about in Forbes magazine. It was older than that, quieter than that. When the Caldwell had been accumulating wealth, influence, and silence for over 4 generations, they built hospitals, they funded political campaigns, they endowed university wings that bore their name in gold letters. And when things went wrong, and things did go wrong, they had enough money and enough lawyers to make sure the story never left the room. That is the world Ethan Caldwell was born into, and for most of his 37 years on this earth, it was the only world he had ever known. Ethan was the youngest of 3 children born to Raymond Caldwell, the patriarch of the Caldwell family empire, and his wife, Margaret, a woman who had grown up modestly in rural Ohio and who, by all accounts, never quite adjusted to the weight of the name she had married into. When Raymond Caldwell had built the family's pharmaceutical distribution company into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise across the 1980s and 1990s. And by the time Ethan was born in 1986, the family was already firmly entrenched in the upper tier of American wealth. Raymond had 2 older children from a previous marriage, a daughter named Victoria and a son named Marcus. And then Ethan, the child of his second wife, Margaret, the one he called his miracle, the one who came when the doctors had said it wouldn't happen again. From the outside, Ethan's childhood looked like something out of a catalog. Private schools in Connecticut, summers in Martha's Vineyard, a trust fund that would have set most people up for life before they ever took their first job. But people who knew Ethan really knew him. Not the Ethan who appeared at charity galas and ribbon cuttings. Described something different. They described a boy who was quietly uncomfortable in his own skin. A boy who spent hours in the garden behind the family estate, not because he was idle, but because it was the only place on the property where nobody was watching him. A boy who, by the time he reached his teenage years, had developed a habit of disappearing for days at a time without telling anyone where he was going, only to reappear looking somehow more at peace than when he had left.
His relationship with his half-siblings, Marcus and Victoria, was complicated from the beginning. Marcus was 12 years older than Ethan and had inherited their father's sharp business instincts, along with what people who worked for the family described as his father's capacity for ruthlessness. Victoria was 10 years older and had built her own career in corporate law, the kind of law that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with strategy. Neither of them had grown up with Ethan in the same household for any meaningful length of time, and yet the moment their father's health began to decline in the early 2000s, both Marcus and Victoria became intensely interested in their youngest half-brother and his place in the family's succession plans. Because Raymond Caldwell had done something that neither Marcus nor Victoria had anticipated. He had changed his will. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The details of Raymond Caldwell's estate and the changes he made to his will in the last years of his life became the subject of significant legal scrutiny later on. But at the time, only a handful of people knew what had happened. Raymond, facing a diagnosis of early-stage Parkinson's disease in 2011, had begun spending more time with Ethan than he ever had before. People who observed the two of them during that period said it was as though Raymond was trying to make up for something. He took Ethan on a trip to Japan. He gave him a first edition of a book Ethan had loved as a child. He sat with him for long evenings on the porch of the family estate in Connecticut and talked about things that Raymond Caldwell had never talked about with anyone: regrets, mistakes, the ways he had failed the people who mattered most to him. And somewhere in those conversations, Raymond made a decision. He instructed his personal attorney, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had served the family for over 2 decades, to restructure his estate so that Ethan would receive the controlling share of the Caldwell family holdings upon Raymond's death. bypassing the arrangement that had previously given equal shares to all three children. It was not a small adjustment. It was a seismic shift in the distribution of one of the largest private fortunes in the northeastern United States. And when Raymond died in March of 2019 after a prolonged decline, and when Gerald Marsh sat the three Caldwell children down in a conference room in Manhattan to read the terms of the updated will, the reaction from Marcus and Victoria was, by all accounts, something that Gerald Marsh would describe years later as the most frightening moment of his professional life.
Marcus did not raise his voice. That was what made it frightening. He simply looked at Gerald Marsh with an expression that the attorney would later describe as completely flat, completely still, and completely cold. And then he said very quietly, "We'll be in touch." Victoria said nothing at all. She gathered her things and left the room. Ethan, sitting between them, looked at neither of them. He looked at the table. And in the weeks that followed, as attorneys began the formal process of transferring the estate, Ethan told the one close friend he had at the time, a man named Daniel Torres who had been his college roommate at Brown, that he felt as though something had fundamentally changed, that the air around him felt different, that he kept having the sensation of being watched. He was right to feel that way. What happened over the next 2 years between Raymond Caldwell's death in March 2019 and the night of October 14th, 2025, when Ethan was officially declared dead in the basement morgue of St. Clement's Hospital in Boston, is a story that involves money and power and the extraordinary lengths that people who have always had both will go to in order to keep them. But it is also, at its core, a story about a woman named Maya Collins. And to understand why Maya Collins was standing outside the morgue door of St. Clement's Hospital at 11:47 on a cold October night, pressing her cracked and calloused hand against cold metal and listening with absolute certainty to something no one else in that building believed was there, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the beginning of Maya's story, which in many ways is the real beginning of this one. Maya Collins was 31 years old on the night that Ethan Caldwell was declared dead. She had been unhoused for approximately 3 years at that point, sleeping in the network of shelters and outdoor encampments that existed in the blocks surrounding St. Clement's Hospital, an area of Boston that had been the subject of ongoing city debates about urban development and housing policy for the better part of a decade. Before those 3 years, Maya had been a licensed practical nurse. Before that, she had been a wife and a mother. She had grown up in Roxbury, the daughter of a postal worker named Harold Collins and a school librarian named Frances Collins, both of whom had instilled in her from childhood a bone-deep sense of duty to other people and an almost stubborn refusal to look away from things that were wrong. She had worked in healthcare for over 20 years, the majority of it in long-term care facilities and in the emergency departments of underfunded hospitals, where the work was relentless and the pay was not enough and the emotional cost was enormous. People who had worked with Maya in those years described her in remarkably consistent terms. They described her as someone who paid attention, not the performative attention of someone trying to seem caring, but the real deep, granular attention of someone who genuinely could not turn it off. She noticed things. She noticed when a patient's breathing pattern had shifted in a way that didn't match their chart. She noticed when a family member in the waiting room was holding themselves in a way that suggested they already knew the news was bad before anyone had told them. She noticed when something was wrong in a room long before the monitors or the readings confirmed it. It was that quality, that particular kind of attention, that had made her an exceptional nurse, and it was that same quality that had, over time, cost her a great deal. Because when you are someone who cannot stop noticing what is wrong, and when you work in systems that are built in part on not noticing, or on noticing and choosing not to act, the friction eventually becomes unbearable. Maya had filed complaints. She had raised concerns with supervisors. She had documented things and submitted reports through official channels and watched those reports disappear into administrative silence. She had, at one facility in particular, witnessed what she believed was a pattern of patient neglect, so systematic and so deliberately concealed that she had gone outside the institution entirely and contacted the state health department. What followed was not the outcome she had hoped for. There was an investigation, yes, but investigations of that kind into facilities with the right legal representation and the right connections have a way of concluding without the conclusions that the evidence would seem to demand. Maya was not fired. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she was quietly reassigned, then given reduced hours, then placed on a performance improvement plan that cited issues with her interpersonal communication and her difficulty accepting supervisory direction. By 2018, after fighting it for months through every legitimate channel available to her, she had resigned. She was 50 years old. She had a nursing license that now felt like a document from a previous life. Her marriage, which had been strained for years by the weight of everything she carried, had ended 2 years earlier. Her two children were grown and living in other cities, and the distance between them was not only geographic. Within a year, she had lost her apartment. Within 18 months, she was sleeping in a shelter on Tremont Street, 4 blocks from St. Clement's Hospital, Suburban, where she had done her nursing clinicals 25 years before, and where, on the night of October 14th, a man whose heart had been declared permanently stopped was lying in the basement morgue, alone. Now here is something important, something that gets lost in the more sensational versions of this story that circulated in the media in the weeks and months after that night. Maya Collins was not a mystic. She was not someone who claimed to have visions or supernatural gifts. She was not, as some of the early tabloid coverage implied, a delusional woman whose years of hardship had untethered her from reality. She was a trained medical professional with over 2 decades of clinical experience, a finely calibrated instinct for physiological distress, and a brain that had spent a career processing subtle signals that most people were not trained to detect. When Maya Collins stood outside that morgue door and said she heard something, she was not speaking metaphorically. She was not speaking spiritually. She was speaking as a clinician. She was saying, with the precision that her training demanded, that she had detected something that did not belong in a room that was supposed to contain only the dead. So what had brought her to that door in the first place was something that, in the retelling, sounds almost too convenient, but which subsequent investigation confirmed in every detail. Maya had spent that evening, as she spent most evenings when the weather permitted, in the area just outside the hospital's East Wing loading dock, a spot that was relatively sheltered from the wind and where the facility's staff rarely bothered the small group of unhoused individuals who gathered there. It was not a comfortable existence, but it was a known one, and Maya had developed over her months in that location a familiarity with the hospital's rhythms, the shift changes, the delivery schedules, the ambient noise patterns of a large medical facility that was almost as detailed as her knowledge of its clinical operations. She knew, for example, that the basement ventilation system on the east side of the building ran loudest between 10 and midnight. She knew that the service elevator to the morgue was operated manually and made a specific grinding sound when it descended. She knew that the loading dock lights flickered for approximately 40 seconds after they were switched on before stabilizing. She knew these things the way a person knows the sounds of a house they have lived in for years, not consciously cataloged, but instantly recognizable. So when at approximately 11:15 on the night of October 14th, she heard something that did not fit any of the patterns she knew, she noticed it. She noticed it in the way she had always noticed things that were wrong. She noticed it the way you notice a single wrong note in a piece of music you have heard 100 times. It was a sound she described later, when investigators finally took her statement seriously, as a low, irregular percussion, faint, rhythmic but not quite steady, coming from below the level of the dock, through the foundation wall of the building, at a frequency that her body registered before her mind had fully processed it. It was, she said, unmistakably biological, and it was coming from the direction of the morgue. She did not act immediately. She sat with it for several minutes, listening, reasoning, running through the alternative explanations the way she had been trained to do. Mechanical vibration from the ventilation system, settling of the building's structure in the cold, noise from a neighboring property transmitted through the ground. She eliminated them one by one, not because she was certain she was right, but because she was certain enough to act. She got up. She walked to the morgue entrance on the basement level, the external access door that was used for transfers. She pressed her hand against it and she listened. And then she knocked. And then she shouted. And then she did what she had always done when she knew something was wrong and the system around her was not listening. She made noise until someone came. The first person who came was a security guard named Thomas Briggs, who had worked the night shift at St. Clement's for 11 years, and who, by his own admission, had responded to the basement exterior door perhaps twice in his entire tenure. He would later say that the woman he found there, disheveled, insistent, pressing her ear to the door and speaking with a calm and clinical specificity that he did not expect, was not someone he could easily dismiss. She did not seem unstable. She did not seem frightened. She seemed, he said, like someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and was waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called the charge nurse on the overnight shift, a woman named Patricia Owens, who had been a nurse for 30 years and who, when she heard the description of what the woman outside was claiming, felt something shift in her stomach. Patricia Owens had been the receiving nurse when Ethan Caldwell had been brought in earlier that evening. She had been present when the attending physician, Dr. Samuel Reeves, had called time of death at 11:47 p.m. She had seen the flatline. She had seen the documentation. She had initialed the transfer form when the body was moved to the morgue at 12:22 a.m. But she was also a nurse with 30 years of experience. And something about the certainty in Maya Collins' voice, relayed to her through the phone by a security guard who was clearly shaken, made her walk down to the basement herself. What happened in the next 6 minutes inside that morgue is the part of this story that has been told and retold and contested and confirmed across dozens of news cycles, 2 separate hospital investigations, and 1 civil lawsuit that was settled out of court under terms that neither party is permitted to discuss. But the core of it, the part that no one disputes, is this. Patricia Owens entered the morgue. She approached the drawer where Ethan Caldwell had been placed. She opened it. She placed 2 fingers on his neck. And she felt something. Faint, irregular, almost imperceptible, but real. Unmistakably real. She pressed the emergency call button on the wall, and she started shouting for the crash team. And in the hallway outside, she could hear Maya Collins, still standing at the exterior door, saying in a voice that was absolutely steady, "I told you, I told you." The crash team that responded to Patricia Owens' call found Ethan Caldwell in a state that the medical literature describes, in cases of this extraordinary rarity, as a variant of the Lazarus phenomenon, a spontaneous return of circulation following the cessation of resuscitation efforts, caused in some documented cases by delayed drug absorption, auto-PEEP in patients on mechanical ventilation, or hyperkalemia reversal. It is vanishingly rare. It is also, critically, almost never caught, because the patients in whom it occurs are, by that point, already in the morgue. What made this case different was Maya Collins. What made Ethan Caldwell alive on October 15th instead of buried by October 20th was a 51-year-old unhoused woman with 2 decades of clinical training, a refusal to look away from things that were wrong, and a pair of ears that the medical establishment had not thought to include in its protocols. He was transferred to the ICU. He was placed on a ventilator. His core temperature was stabilized. Over the following 72 hours, under the care of a team that now included neurologists, cardiologists, and specialists in hypoxic brain injury, Ethan Caldwell began, slowly and improbably, to come back. The Caldwell family was notified at approximately 3 a.m. on October 15th. Marcus Caldwell, he reached by phone at his home in Greenwich, Connecticut, said very little when the hospital administrator told him what had happened. He asked 2 questions. He asked about Ethan's prognosis, and then he asked about the woman who had raised the alarm. The administrator, who had no reason to think there was anything unusual about the question, told him her name. Marcus Caldwell said thank you and hung up the phone. It was that phone call and what happened in the weeks that followed it that transformed a remarkable medical story into something much larger and much darker. Because as Ethan Caldwell lay in the ICU, fighting his way back to consciousness, and as the story of his impossible survival began to leak into the Boston media and then into the national press, when investigators looking into the circumstances of his initial cardiac event began to find things that did not add up, the toxicology report that came back in the week following his resuscitation showed traces of a compound in his bloodstream that should not have been there. A compound that, in sufficient quantities and in combination with certain cardiac medications that Ethan had been prescribed, could produce exactly the physiological presentation that Dr. Samuel Reeves had observed and documented as natural cardiac death, a compound that, in the concentrations detected, was not something that occurred naturally and was not something Ethan Caldwell had any record of being prescribed. It was, investigators would later determine after months of painstaking work, a compound that had been introduced into Ethan Caldwell's system deliberately. And when the trail of that compound was followed backward through pharmacological records, through the network of the Caldwell family's business relationships, through the financial transactions that had moved quietly through a series of shell accounts in the months following Raymond Caldwell's death and the reading of his will, it led somewhere that, even for people who had been following the story closely and who thought they had prepared themselves for the worst, was genuinely difficult to absorb. It led to Marcus. Not exclusively, not simply. The full picture that emerged over the following 18 months of investigation was one of layered complicity and calculated deniability. The kind of architecture that people with enormous resources and experienced legal counsel can construct around themselves when they have had enough warning and enough time. Victoria's role was more peripheral, more about what she had known and chosen not to report than about active participation. There were intermediaries. There were individuals who had carried out specific elements of the plan in exchange for compensation, and who, when they eventually cooperated with investigators, described a scheme that had been in active planning for over a year before October 14th. The plan had been to eliminate Ethan quietly, in a way that would look like a natural cardiac event in a young man with a documented history of cardiac arrhythmia. A history that had, it emerged, Sorna been partly manufactured through a series of medical appointments over the preceding 2 years that Marcus had arranged through a physician with connections to the Caldwell family's network. It was meticulous. It was patient. It was the product of people who had grown up watching power operate without consequences and who had every reason to believe that this would be no different. What they had not planned for was Maya Collins. You could spend a long time, and many people have, thinking about the particular cruelty of the position Maya Collins occupied in this story. Here was a woman who had spent her career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, who had been systematically dismantled by the institutions she had tried to hold accountable, who had lost nearly everything and been rendered Heir by the calculation of a system that did not value what she had to offer, effectively invisible. And it was precisely that invisibility, the invisibility of an unhoused woman outside a hospital loading dock at midnight, that had allowed her to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right knowledge, to save a life that very powerful people had decided should end. There is something in that which demands more than a moment's consideration. In the immediate aftermath of the story breaking nationally in late October and early November of 2021, Maya Collins became briefly and intensely famous. Her photograph, taken by a Boston Globe photographer outside St. Clement's Hospital the morning after Ethan's resuscitation, showing her in her worn jacket with her steady eyes and the particular expression of someone who has been proven right about something important and feels no satisfaction in it, became one of the most widely circulated images of that news cycle. She was interviewed by every major outlet. She was described as a hero, as an angel, as a miracle worker, in the breathless language that media coverage reaches for when it encounters a story that does not fit its usual frameworks. Maya Collins accepted none of those descriptions. In interview after interview, she said the same thing with the same quiet firmness. She said she had done what any trained medical professional would have done if they had been paying attention. She said the real question was not why she had acted, but why the systems that were supposed to be paying attention had not. And she said she was glad Ethan was alive. She said she hoped the investigation would produce accountability. And then, in the way of a woman who had long since made her peace with a world that did not always reward doing the right thing, she said she was tired and she would like to go home. Except she did not have a home. And that fact, that the woman who had just saved a billionaire heir's life was sleeping in a shelter 4 blocks away, produced its own wave of public conversation and outrage and complicated emotion that swept through the news cycle for several weeks before being absorbed into the ambient noise of everything else. Ethan Caldwell, for his part, spent 11 weeks in the hospital before being discharged. The neurological damage from the period of oxygen deprivation he had experienced was real, but, the doctor said, certainly less severe than it might have been, a function of how quickly Patricia Owens and her team had responded once Maya's alarm had been heard. He had a long road of rehabilitation ahead of him. He had cognitive work to do. He had a family situation that was now the subject of a federal criminal investigation and would remain so for the foreseeable future. He had, in the bluntest possible terms, a great deal to deal with. What he also had was a clear memory, once his consciousness had returned fully enough for him to form and retain new information, of the name of the woman who had saved his life. His care team had told him about Maya Collins in his second week of consciousness, when he was stable enough to process it. He had asked them to tell him everything they knew about her, and then he had asked them to find her. Maya Collins was located through the shelter system without difficulty. She came to the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after Ethan had first asked for her. She wore the same jacket. She carried the same quiet steadiness. She sat in the chair beside his hospital bed and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a clinician evaluating a patient's condition. And Ethan Caldwell, who had spent his entire life surrounded by people whose interest in him was inseparable from what he could do for them, found that he could not immediately speak. What was said in that room in the hour that followed has never been publicly reported, because neither Maya Collins nor Ethan Caldwell has ever spoken about it in detail. What is known is that when Maya left the hospital that afternoon, so she left with a document signed by Ethan Caldwell's attorney. It was a document that addressed her immediate housing situation, her legal fees from the workplace retaliation case she had never been able to fully pursue, and a number of other things that fall into the category of what should have happened years ago and didn't. It was not, by the standards of the Caldwell family fortune, a large sum of money. By the standards of Maya Collins' life over the preceding 3 years, it was something that required her to sit very still for a long moment after she read it. She thanked Ethan. She told him to keep doing his physical therapy consistently and not to skip sessions when he was tired, because that was when skipping was most tempting and also most costly. He said he would try. She said trying was fine, but doing was better. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. And then she left. The criminal proceedings against Marcus Caldwell moved through the federal system with the deliberate pace of cases involving defendants with significant legal resources and the kind of evidence that has to be built carefully to be built durably. Charges were filed in the spring of 2022. The trial, when it finally came, lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from the intermediaries who had cooperated with investigators. From Gerald Marsh, who described in precise detail the reaction in that conference room on the day the will was read, and from a pharmacological expert who walked the jury through the science of what had been done to Ethan's body and how, and what it would have taken to orchestrate it. Marcus Caldwell maintained throughout the trial that the evidence against him was circumstantial and the product of investigators who had been captivated by a dramatic narrative at the expense of rigorous proof. His defense team was skilled, and the arguments they made were not without substance. But the jury deliberated for 3 days and returned a verdict that surprised no one who had paid close attention to the evidence. And Marcus Caldwell was sentenced to a term in federal prison that his attorneys immediately began the process of appealing. Victoria's situation resolved differently. The cooperation she eventually provided to investigators in exchange for a negotiated outcome that many observers found inadequate kept her out of prison but cost her legal career and her position within the Caldwell family holdings. And the civil suits that Ethan brought against multiple parties involved in what had been done to him were ongoing for years, moving through the legal system with the slow, grinding progress of disputes where both sides have the resources to fight indefinitely. Through all of it, Maya Collins continued to live her life. The housing that Ethan's initial document had secured for her turned out to be a foundation on which she was able to build something more stable than anything she had had in years. She did not return to formal nursing. The licensing process after a gap of several years was complicated, and she was honest with herself about the toll that 2 decades in an under-resourced healthcare system had taken on her capacity to do that work again in the same way. But she found her way, through a combination of the public attention her story had brought and the network she had maintained from her years in healthcare advocacy, into something that fit her better than any single institutional role ever had. She began working with an organization in Boston that provided healthcare navigation services to unhoused individuals, helping people access the medical system understand their options, advocate for themselves in clinical encounters where the power differential could be overwhelming. She was, by every account of everyone who worked with her or was served by her, extraordinary at it. Not because she had saved a billionaire's life and become famous, but because she was Maya Collins, because she paid attention, because she could not look away from things that were wrong, and she had never learned how to stop acting on what she saw. Ethan Caldwell's recovery was long and nonlinear and real. He had good months and hard months. He had days when the cognitive effects of his oxygen deprivation felt distant and manageable, and days when they did not. He reduced his involvement in the Caldwell family business holdings to the minimum required by his role as primary heir, and spent increasing amounts of time in endeavors that had nothing to do with the world he had grown up in. He and Maya Collins stayed in contact. Not frequently, and not in any way that the public or the press had visibility into, but steadily. She would call occasionally to ask how the physical therapy was going. He would call occasionally to ask if there was anything her organization needed. It was, by all accounts, a relationship built entirely on the specific kind of mutual respect that exists between people who have seen each other in moments that strip everything else away. There is something this story keeps returning to, something that does not resolve cleanly into any of the frameworks that the news coverage tried to give it. It is not simply a story about the corruption of the wealthy, though it is that. It is not simply a story about the heroism of the overlooked, though it is that too. It is at its most essential level a story about attention, about what it costs a society to systematically devalue and discard the people who are best at paying it, about what we lose when we build systems that process people like Maya Collins through institutions until those institutions have taken everything they needed from her and given back as little as possible, and then released her into a life that her country had decided she did not deserve any better than. Maya Collins saved Ethan Caldwell's life because she was exactly where the world had put her, doing exactly what the world had trained her to do, and because she had never, through everything, through all of it, lost the habit of noticing what was wrong and doing something about it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only thing in this entire story that worked the way it was supposed to. The rest of it, the wealth and the power and the plans made in quiet rooms by people who believed themselves untouchable. And that was the part that failed. That was the machinery that, for all its resources and all its careful construction, could not account for one woman, outside a door, in the cold, listening. Ethan Caldwell is alive today. Maya Collins is doing the work she was always meant to do. And somewhere in the distance between those two facts is everything this story has to say about what really matters, and who we choose to listen to, and what it costs us, all of us, when we get that wrong.